I'm Kevin Davis, and this is the Catholic Family Podcast. And today we're going to talk about something extremely topical and political. So, fair warning to anyone who is watching the show. I know it's a Catholic podcast, but we do want to talk about things that are in the news. What are people sitting around the table discussing with their families and their friends? And we think it's an important thing to have on good Catholic men and women to also talk about these topics that are important, and if we're right or wrong, at least to have the discussion and get different thoughts and opinions out there. And today, I'm happy to be joined by two geopolitical experts, Matt and Alexander Arthur, and they're going to help kind of guide us through what is going on in Russia and Ukraine. So thanks for joining, guys.
No, thank you, Kevin. So I've got about 10 degrees in political science. I've been keeping up with this really since 1930, to be honest, with this Russian history. So I think that everything I say here is just true, and I just know everything about the political and the war at the moment. So I hope everyone can benefit from all this knowledge I can bestow upon your viewers.
You look good for your age, I must say. So since 1930,
yeah, no worries, yeah, thank you. Yeah, I appreciate that. No, but
and
I look forward to sharing more knowledge.
Alexander also. I mean, he is the younger brother, but he has similar experience, I think.
Yep. Well, I have been Russian for about 60% of my life, so I'll hopefully be able to draw on that in particular.
I don't think we can keep this up for too long.
I know. Okay, everyone who's watching, obviously the joke is that we are not experts. We are not geopolitical experts. We are three guys who, we've done some research. We've delved into it a little bit. These are strictly our opinions. We could totally be wrong about all of it. If we're wrong morally, then obviously that's an issue, and we are very willing to hear that, and then we'll delete it immediately. But I think that's not too much at risk. So perhaps we're wrong politically. That can happen. We're going to try not to be. We're going to try to give what we know to be facts, and try to get people thinking about the topic again, maybe from a slightly different perspective. Again, take it with a grain of salt. We're just three guys. We're not experts. Matt was not around in 1930, and Alexander is not Russian. So let's get into it, guys.
We're only partly Ukrainian.
Only partly Ukrainian. Okay, I
guess. Oh yeah, we technically are. Yeah.
Okay, well then you guys have a lot that's going on here. Maybe relevant.
We're partly everything, so I don't think it matters much.
You guys are mutts, like many Americans. We're mutts too. We just have a mix of all sorts.
Yeah, that's it.
But I think before we get going too, we need to make sure we say that all of the people suffering in Ukraine and in Russia and all around the world from war, it is extremely sad and tragic, and we should pray for them and help them in ways that we can. I think that's absolutely the case. That is not a laughing matter. I know we joked about this at the beginning of the show. It is a very serious topic, but we wanted to kind of break the ice a little bit and kind of show that, again, this is just from our perspective, and maybe we're wrong. And but we don't take it lightly. It is a very serious thing, and we do pray for those that are suffering. And war in general is evil and is condemned, of course, by the Catholic Church. It's not that simple always, but typically that is the case. But that's something we're going to get a little bit into today as well. And I think, Alex, I'd like to send it to you first, if you will, or if you're willing to give us maybe an overview of what is going on in Russia and Ukraine.
Well, the real problem is that it is a very complicated matter, which is very based in history and does go back a fair while. So it's quite hard to really have that much of a summary of the whole situation. Because, I mean, even just one in particular, you could even say that the clash between Ukraine and Russia was almost decided from the history of what took place in the Soviet Union, when the Soviet Union actually divided up Russia proper, the Empire of Russia, into the different Soviet republics. When they created the Ukrainian Soviet Republic and the Belarusian Soviet Republic, and then they started racially deporting all the Ukrainians to Ukraine, and then the Belarusians to Belarus, and the Kazakhs to Kazakhstan. That was when they really tore the fabric of the Russian Empire and the Russian culture and society at the time, and then set a collision course even to today. But even that is really a brief summary because of the amount of things that took place. But as far as the direct cause for now, and in a way why it happened now, that's obviously more recent. But if you want to choose one event, you'd probably be talking about the coup which took place in 2014, where President Yanukovych of Ukraine was ousted from the Ukrainian presidency, obviously, and was pursued out of Russia, out of Ukraine into Crimea, which at that point had become integrated into Russia. It didn't take very long for Crimea to become part of Russia once the coup took place. And I guess that really is the big point, because once that happened, that caused almost a succession crisis, because as soon as there is a major tear in the cohesion of a government and the society, then you start to have all these different points of view where people have support for one side and then people have support for another, and there's no clear succession line. So there are people throughout Ukraine who would think, I don't support coup, I don't support revolution, I support the previously elected president. And then there are the others who didn't care because they were happy with the president who they got afterwards. And that is very particular. What happened in Crimea, for instance, is that they just as a brief summary, they weren't happy with the concept of Ukraine very clearly having their president ousted for having pro-Russia leanings, because they knew that if he's being ousted for that, then the response would be a replacement president who would have anti-Russian leanings. And because of that, they then held the referendum. I guess people can make what they will of the legitimacy of that. But I think one thing which is kind of telling, which I've seen some geopolitical commentators suggest, is that in the whole time since Ukraine had their referendum where they joined Russia, no one in the West has really suggested having another one. And the general consensus is if they have another one, then it'll just prove that the Crimeans do want to be with Russia.
So wait, did Ukraine have a referendum or Crimea?
Crimea had its own referendum.
Okay.
It was its own region. It has its own referendum. However, the reason why people might bring up doubts surrounding it is because Crimea was occupied by the Russian forces. It wasn't invaded. Some people say it was invaded. It wasn't invaded because the Russians were actually already there. The city of Sevastopol it's the basis of the Russian Black Sea Fleet, and it has been the basis of the Russian Black Sea Fleet for 300-400 years. And so after the Soviet Union ended and the Ukrainians left, they took Crimea with them and then Sevastopol with them. But the deal was that they would maintain allowing the Russians to use Sevastopol for their Black Sea Fleet, partly because Sevastopol is the only Sevastopol is the only port in Russia which does not get frozen in the winter. So it's always open, and it's extremely important. It's the only naval capability. It allows the only naval capability really for the Russians in the southern part in the Black Sea. And so that was why Russia was already there, and that was why they obviously wanted to keep it. So the Russians occupied the rest of Crimea, or whatever was important. It wasn't that hard from all accounts. They didn't really try very hard. And then they held the referendum, and then the Crimeans voted, by all accounts, overwhelmingly to go back to Russia. That's a basic overview of Crimea in particular.
And so there was no invasion. There was no military invasion. It was an occupation already. And so, but I remember the Crimean issue, but was it a particularly bloody coup? I don't honestly entirely know the story of that. Was it bloody? Was it a revolt, or was it kind of like, hey, yeah, we're here and now Crimea is ours in terms of Russia's point of view?
Well, there was no coup in Crimea. That didn't take place. The coup took place in Kiev. It never actually reached Crimea. What happened in Crimea was purely the Russians who were already there just moved down the street, took control of anything important. Um, it was extremely quick, and then they said we're having a referendum. I don't actually even know who first had the idea. I've heard accounts that there were people in Crimea were saying, actually, we don't want to be part of Ukraine. Is it possible for us to have a referendum? And the Russians were always going to be extremely quick with Crimea. But if you're talking about the coup in the rest of the country, that's a slightly different matter. In Kiev, I think it was either 140 or 160 people were killed from the accounts, mostly police and what they called Euromaidan protesters. Maidan was the name of the square inside Kiev where the protesters sort of hold themselves up. Maidan means independence. And so there were the Euromaidan protesters who were the independents. We want to be working with Europe. That's another point which gets controversial as to how much they were actually being controlled or funded or supported. But it seems there were even American overseas officials in Ukraine at the time who are quoted to have said that they were actually themselves were quite ashamed because they could see how much the United States was interacting directly with the protesters, the organizers of the protests.
And I've seen several videos and pictures of people like John McCain and others that were directly, I mean, really, they pretty high up political figures in the U.S. that were directly involved or supportive of the at least of the after effects of the coup. And so, again, it's one of those things that we kind of want to talk about that this all comes off right now in the media as being Putin is bad, Putin is evil, Putin is insane. What is he doing? And maybe that's all true. I mean, maybe he is bad, evil, and insane. But this whole idea of he just randomly is doing this, that this just came from nowhere, is absolutely a farce. It's absolutely insane. I mean, when you see that America and NATO are actively aiding or overthrowing a Russia friendly government, which, as far as I know, was democratically elected, democracy being its own issue, I suppose, but still being the case, still so elected, reasonably. And how are we surprised that Putin is upset about this? It's just like, why do we just think he's just going to take? Oh yeah, his next door neighbor, at the very least, that used to even be part of Russia, but at least right next to them, is now being manipulated and overthrown by NATO. I mean, it's pretty serious,
Yeah, I think
Go ahead,
I'll
Matt.
go.
No, you go.
I was just gonna say, actually, I'm gonna steal Alex's thunder. When we were talking about stuff preparing for this show, I thought he made a really good point, which we've yet to make. And it's when you're looking at war history, you're not going to get very far if you look at it through the lens of who are the good guys and who are the bad guys, because it just doesn't really work like that in politics, right? It's secular politics. And I think it's really important that when we're talking about this, we're just trying to just I guess present what we have found that might be facts, or things we have found that we think might be true, or we believe probably are true because it's substantiated. But just it is possible, right? So we're from Australia. We're part of Western, like the I guess you could say the Allied forces. We are allied with the US, right? So of course we're going to be patriotic about our country and want to defend our country and stuff. But we're not going to be like, oh, but Australia is always the good guys in as much as they can't do any wrong, and therefore our allies, such as the US, England, whatever. Yeah, like we're on the same side politically, but doesn't mean that what our governments do or what our armed forces do, or whatever, is is always the right thing. So we're just looking at this from a perspective of, all right, what are the facts? Generally, when you have wars, you can have two sides that have genuine causes for war, and you can't really say these are the bad guys or these are the good guys. You might be able to say, well, maybe this side kind of had a bit more of a justification, like maybe their reason for going to the war was a bit, I guess, more directly going to affect them and the security of their nation, maybe than another side. But at the same time, there's always going to be these motives, right? Nations aren't just going to go to war for no reason. So I think that's one thing that's really important that we think about this. So if we start saying something like, this is something important and something important to know about Russia, and then you might sort of think, oh, that kind of makes it look like what Russia's doing isn't crazy. There's no need to get defensive. You could just go, okay, that makes sense. And then if we start saying, oh, maybe America's done this, again, we're not saying America's the bad guy or the good guy, because we don't believe in that exists in this case. Well, I don't believe that exists. I'm just going to add it from what's actually happening here. So that's all I wanted to really chime in there. And I don't think I can provide much more value, because clearly Alexander knows a lot more about this than I do. So I'll let it continue.
Yeah, maybe I'll ask Alexander then. I mean, because this is kind of one of the biggest points or the issues is why did Putin now invade? What's the reason? If there is a reason besides him just being insane and a despot who just wants chaos and war, which I think that's a pretty silly assumption. I've heard some people say that he's gone on a roid rage. He's got too many steroids, and it's just made him go crazy. Which is, again, it just shows you the media is just trying to point to a reason, anything that is not that doesn't make sense. That he just has to be insane. And so Alex, maybe you can say from your perspective, what might be the reasons that he has invaded Ukraine?
Well, one thing I will mention just quick on what you mentioned about how the media portrays him is that it just sort of goes to show how, in general, the media does like to hold on to their cake and eat it too, so to speak, because on the one day, there's one person is crazy and insane, but they're simultaneously an evil genius who is able to puppet the entire world. But they're absolutely insane, but they're an evil genius who, oh man, that they can organize an attack which like completely decides the entirety of the American election, for instance. But he's insane. He's got no sense at all. So that is possibly a point to keep in mind, is that as soon as people start throwing around accusations, well, it's already counterproductive. It's undiplomatic, and in the end, politics is decided by diplomacy. And the problem I think people have to worry about with Russians is that they do, and historically have had, quite a sense of national pride. And you could say that the pride of a nation is often funneled into the leader of that nation. And so when the leader of your nation does something you're proud of, it really hits you. And if people make fun of if people make a joke, if people make a mockery of your leader, then it really can be a bit, even if you're not even the biggest supporter, you feel like it reflects on the people and on the country, especially if you think it's unfair. And that's actually a reason I've heard why Putin is actually very popular in Russia. People tend to contest that. It's like, there can't be that many. It's all fake. There's no one actually votes. But I have seen interviews with I'm not sure if you've heard of a guy named Vladimir Posner. 2 guesses as to what country he's from.
Sounds pretty Russian.
He's actually French. Yeah, I did want to keep that one. But he worked quite heavily in international. That's not a joke. He actually is French. He never went to Russia until he was I think 19 or 20. Anyway, he worked in media internationally from the Soviet period through the 90s, and then to a lesser extent in the 2000s. And he worked back and forth, and he said people in the West, they just basically need to accept that he knows from what he can tell. He says Putin is heavily supported. That doesn't. Russia has an extremely low voter count, a very low percentage that votes, but they do. The ones who turn out, he is heavily supported. And he said one of the reasons for that is because he's the first leader that the Russians have had since the Soviet period, and they don't have much pride in the leaders of the Soviet period. He's the first leader who, as they say, stood up to the American bully, which is really how they see the United States. He was the one who came out and he said, this is back in 2007, he came out and he said, America, or NATO in particular, they need to keep away from Ukraine. Keep away. At that point, Georgia was also an issue which people have forgotten about. So they need to keep away because they don't want to poke the bear. And the Russians actually appreciated that because they saw Yeltsin as a bit of a pushover, and they saw Gorbachev as kind of a bit of a favor. Gorbachev is seen more positively in the West than in Russia, interestingly enough. But as for this particular question, which was why is it happening now, there are quite a few reasons for why now in particular. People might think that it's all very sudden. That's not true. The people call it the Russo-Ukrainian War. That's because they don't want to admit the fact that it's a Ukrainian civil war which Russia has taken a side in and has now entered. Or even more, I guess, offensive to Western ears will be that if you're really looking at the specifics, it's almost a war of independence for the states that are in the east of Ukraine, but people do not want to admit that because that doesn't fit with the narrative. So it's the Russo-Ukrainian War, and it has been going on since 2014 for about 8 years. As for why, one big reason for why now in particular is that just recently Zelensky terminated, I completely forget what it was called, but it was a treaty drawn up. It was an agreement between Russia and Ukraine regarding the dealing of atomic weapons. And what happened was Ukraine was to repudiate becoming an atomic power, and they were to disassemble and return all of their atomic weapons to Russia. People that they did that was all well and good. Just recently, Zelensky terminated that treaty and said that is no longer binding. Now, if people want to be devil's advocate, they can say, oh, well, that doesn't prove that he actually wants to use atomic weapons. But I don't think the Russians are going to think that. And one thing the Russians do also know is that Ukraine very much still has the capability to create atomic weapons. They have the capability more than many other countries which are already trying. That's because they have the infrastructure and the factories and the know-how from when they used to be one of the most important Soviet socialist republics. They were a huge industrial center. That they were very important. They know how to do it, and that's a worry for Russia. Is that this treaty was terminated? I guess you could say, a la USA, because that's something they've been.
That's what I thought too. Exactly. You got Zelensky, who's this actor president. I mean, you know, in a young guy. I mean, I guess think of that as you will. I mean, Trump is practically the same, but at least Trump was not just an actor. He was also a very respected businessman who had built things and had dealt with very high level people for a long time. Zelensky was a guy who was like, it was an actor on a soap opera, right? I mean, practically. I mean, he was a total nobody who won an election because he had the same story on a TV show that then somehow became reality. And then, I mean, I can only imagine. And Alex, as you say, for that to happen, and for him to go and end a treaty like this, Zelensky. I mean, you got to. I mean, Putin's got to be thinking, yeah, right. Zelensky ended this. Sure, of course, this is all on him. That's come on. This is, of course, this is the U.S. and NATO putting their fingers even more into the pie.
Well, that's another interesting thing as to why that's particularly relevant. Is that the cities of Ukraine are Ukraine is so close to Russia. And I think I heard the statistic, or just the fact, once, that the city of Kharkov, or Kharkiv, if you're being politically correct, if they fired there are varying levels of nuclear weapons, but if they fired one at Moscow, a hypersonic missile would hit Moscow within 5 minutes of being fired. The next step up would take about 10 minutes. And I think the slowest is about half an hour. Would take at any point, if there were nuclear weapons in Ukraine, they could hit Moscow with potentially 10 minutes of warning. And just on Zelensky and his election, interestingly, there it is quite possible. Some people will always bring up the controversy as to whether it was actually all that legitimate or not. It very possibly could have been, though, because Zelensky, first of all, he was quite popular. He wasn't hugely popular, but he was quite popular through that TV show, as you mentioned, which was a political commentary, so to speak, making fun of the bumbling president. It was meant to be a political commentary. That wasn't the biggest thing, though, is that when he started running, his promises, his electoral promises, which the Ukrainians obviously have not learned to disbelieve yet, because they've not been a democracy for long enough, is, first of all, his promise was to work more closely with Russia to end the war in Donbass, which is the whole issue. His promise was, we'll work closely with Russia to end the war in Donbass. His second promise was to end the oligarchy corruption, which Ukraine is a absolute hot pot of corruption. Well, actually, I possibly have something here. Yeah, I was looking something up just recently. So apparently, the United States directly controls the National Agency on Corruption Prevention, the National Anti-Corruption Bureau, the Specialized Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office, and the High Anti-Corruption Court. So every anti-corruption organization in Ukraine is directly under the influence of the United States, because they wanted to end the corruption more quickly. Somehow that didn't work. Anyway, so his promise was to end the corruption and the oligarchy corruption. People seem to forget at that point that his TV show was actually heavily funded by a Ukrainian oligarch who was, I think, in exile at that point for some reason. He was, I don't think he was allowed back in Ukraine. But either way, he was heavily funded by him. The third reason for why it's plausible for him to have won is that he was running against Poroshenko, who was the president who replaced Yanukovych. He was the president who was elected through the Euromaidan protests. And Poroshenko was, how do we put it nicely, he was an animal. What he did in Ukraine, he was the kicker for the war in Donbass. The people in Donbass thought, we're going to do the same thing as Crimea. We're going to hold the referendum. There were two republics, the Donetsk and Luhansk. I don't know if I pronounced that correctly, but they went to the polls and they had their referendum and they voted in favor. And they were like, "Oh, this is great. This is all going to be well and good." Again, people will have controversy about whether that was legitimate or not. But then after they did that, it kicked off the Donbass crisis, which was, they said, "We're leaving." Ukraine said, "No, you're not." Russia said nothing. Actually, Russia didn't step in at that point. They had only stepped in for Ukraine. That's because they were already they only stepped in for Crimea. That's because they were already there. So they had held their referendum and they'd left. Ukraine did not have a leadership, so the decisions could not be made. So they were left in this sort of limbo. And ironically, a majority of the Donbass people actually previously had supported the Euromaidan protests. The Donbass people are what you call blue collar. It's a blue collar region. It's all miners, factory workers. It's just normal. They're not the highfalutin. They're not the Kievans, and so they they had their referendum. They left, etc. And one thing Poroshenko said, I heard a quote once, is that one of the promises Poroshenko made is he said, the first city I will visit will be Donetsk. He said, I will visit there his promise was to resolve the crisis. And as the Donetsk people said, in a cruel kind of irony, he kind of did, because it was only days, I think, wasn't very long after he won the election, that he gave the order for the shelling of those areas to commence. And those areas have been under artillery fire from the Ukrainian military armed forces for about 8 years now. Ever since 2014, these places have been hit by aircraft strikes and by artillery, because the Ukrainians couldn't actually at that point just march in. They weren't organized enough to do that, but they had artillery. And so they started...
So Alexander, so I don't keep up with the mainstream news much, but I'm kind of going to speculate here, because there's a lot of coverage, right, of how Russia's dropping bombs and all this stuff, and that's the narrative. But you're kind of saying that Ukraine's basically been doing that on these people for years, like 8 years, and we just haven't really heard about it. Like, or what's the deal there? Like, if you've got any, how would you address that?
Well, the interest that, in a way, people can hear about it if they wanted to. It is actually out there. You could look it up. There in the European Court of Human Rights, there are a number of cases pending against the Ukrainian armed forces, which have been filed by these republics and also by Russia. But it's just not. It's not often reported on. You can find it, and there are even American diplomatic, I guess, workers who travel overseas who have talked about it. But it's out there. It is getting harder to find. I did notice that when I was preparing for this, I plugged something into Google and I just could find absolutely nothing. But I had to actually find, I'm not sure if anyone else has heard of DuckDuckGo, which for some reason just does not have the same level of filtration or censorship. But either way, from 2014 to date, to the beginning, I think it was recorded that there were 13,000 civilian deaths in Donbass. This is just civilians. But the problem was that as time went on, as the republics gained a bit more, control, they started to be able to, first of all, they managed to keep the Ukrainians out a bit further, the Ukrainian military out, and they were able to establish a bit more of an order, even though the people there basically became part of life. The story was that people's homes were underground bomb shelters. That was just daily life for some people, depending on where they were. Another thing, which I guess a lot of stuff is really it's sort of a look up to verify, and I guess it really depends on how much you'd actually trust the sources, so to speak. But it's never just one place in particular, and these don't always contradict what everyone else is saying. It's just that it's not been said. But one of the things I'd heard is that the Ukrainian armed forces, when they were told to fire the artillery at, I think it was Donetsk or one particular part, they were actually told, the Ukrainian soldiers were told, that the city had been evacuated. They were told there was no one there. But the people in those republics had not been told that anything was going to take place. And there are actual videos of people literally walking down the street. I don't know if it was the first strike, but there's also the video of this guy filming the sky, and he's like, oh, there's a Ukrainian fighter up there, or not fighter, an airplane, and it just shoots a volley of missiles, which then go down into the city, and they target. They're never just targeting random areas, very rarely, but still, it's in cities which have not been evacuated against people who. That was their first warning that there was even a war. They had to organize themselves into militia. There was no military that they had, aside from there were a large number of Russian volunteers. The official narrative does agree that there were a large number of volunteers from Russia. The West says that there were Russian regulars. The Russians say no, we do not send soldiers in there. I guess you can't really say for certain, but there were soldiers there. So, but one of the things that was pointed out when just going back to what I was saying, when they started getting a bit more control over the region, the authorities of Donetsk and Luhansk started to look through basically their own territory, and they started having humanitarian work done. There were international humanitarian workers, and then they started uncovering the mass graves. For instance, they started trying to catalog because they couldn't actually bury. There were too many people to actually be buried with funerals. There were mass graves in streets because the people themselves had to bury them. One anecdote I'd heard is that whoever was giving the Ukrainian artillery orders figured out where these graves were. They kept an eye, and they would wait until people started being buried, and then they would shell the areas again so that they knew that there were people there. And then another thing is that as the humanitarian workers, they were uncovering all these graves, they said it's very hard to even tell exactly who was a civilian and who was a soldier or a militia, because I guess you could say the separatist fighters of the republics, they fought in jeans because they weren't soldiers. They didn't have uniforms. They were just people organized into militia. So that's there was quite a segue there from the election to that, but in a way that people of Ukraine did not very much like Poroshenko. And so this goes back to the original point that Zelensky could very well have won, simply because by running against Poroshenko and promising to end the war in Donbass, the people of Ukraine really supported that perspective.
And so then why then you think it was more of the issue with the nuclear weapons and tearing up the treaty? That's why Putin now invaded rather than invade during the presidency of Poroshenko and the bombing of these two regions. So I mean, so Putin obviously then sees these two regions as wanting to be part of Russia, and he wants to then have them be part of Russia. I assume that's kind of the case. Like Crimea, he's like, okay, they want to be with us, we want them with us, so buzz off and let it be. But then why, if that's the case, why is Putin having more of an all-out attack on Ukraine? I mean invading even the main cities of Kiev and elsewhere.
Well, just one thing to probably point out in particular is that the official Russian narrative is not that they want the two republics incorporated into Russia. All they've said is we support the independence of these two republics. So those two republics, when they become fully independent, if they become fully independent, they're then entitled to say, we now decide to join Russia, which I think is what I think. No, Crimea didn't even do that. They just went straight to Russia. But that's reminiscent again of how a lot of territory actually ended up going to the United States from Mexico, from the Mexican Empire. Is that it's a slightly different situation, because in that case the American settlers were leaving the United States and went to Texas, where they eventually became a majority of the region. And then they said, you know what, we want to be independent. So they said, we're independent. And then the second they said, we're independent, they said, actually, we're part of the United States. And the United States said, yes, please. And then the Mexican War happened, where then at that point, I think at least half of what is now mainland United States left the Mexican Empire. And again, in the Mexican War, just to finish the allegory, so to speak, in the Mexican War, the United States fought all the way to Mexico City, and they captured Mexico City, and they had complete control of the government. And they said, now we'll sign the treaty because you've got no other choice. It's unconditional. And that, I guess, would explain why, for instance, the Russians would want Kiev, why they would want Kharkov, all these major cities. Is once the more territory they have, the more bargaining power they have. And one thing that Putin has gone on record saying is that Ukraine, by holding out too long, risks the maintenance of its own statehood. That can be interpreted as is, first of all, Russia never said they wanted all of Ukraine. That's not part of their goals that they've set. Maybe they have them secretly, but they've never said that. But the problem is that the more Russia incorporates, the more it occupies, eventually it's going to get to the point where they can say, if you can do absolutely nothing, why should we even give you any of your territory back? We have complete control of everything. The diplomatic table is a bargaining to reach a mutual agreement. If we have bits of territory, we can offer you that. We can offer to pull out of that. That's our offer. But if you have absolutely nothing, what can you even offer? You can't even offer to fight anymore. And so I guess I don't really think, just from the political perspective, I don't think it will make sense for Russia to try and incorporate all of Ukraine. It's just too much of a headache. But at the very least, they could force the incorporation of, obviously, their particular particular terms that they've already laid out, that they laid out from the very beginning. As for, I think you said in particular, why to do it now as opposed to, I think back in the days, that what you were asking, why they would do it now instead of back when this was going on. So very shortly afterwards, it was, I think, the very next year. So this had all started where Poroshenko had given the orders, where the civil war had broken out, and the Russians were trying to offer humanitarian aid. But a lot of people looking back had said if Russia had entered then, if they'd gone into Ukraine then, people on both sides had said that would have been a much better decision. But instead, in 2015, the Russians were able to broker an agreement between, particularly between Ukraine, the Ukrainian government, and the two republics. And that's called the Minsk Agreements. This is, I think, a reflection on how, historically speaking, the Russians have always been an extremely diplomatic people. Actually, that may sound a bit crazy to hear. It's not very reminiscent of the Soviet era, but throughout their history, they are very diplomatic, and they normally do try to broker agreements as much as possible. That's one of the reasons why they were such a successful state. They could quite often contain conflicts, or even avoid them altogether. In fact, I guess just an interesting piece of history is that the official conversion of the historical Russians, the country of Russia's at a different point, but that actually took place entirely diplomatically. The king of the Kievan Rus actually came to an agreement with the Greeks at the time, to convert to Christianity. Ironically, it did end up turning into a war because the Greeks broke their side of the treaty. So, and again, that's reminiscent. So, in 2015, the Minsk agreement was signed by Ukraine and by the two republics. And this did. There are a number of things. I haven't read the treaty itself. That might take quite a while. But of the things I know about it, one of the things is that it limits, for instance, the use of certain weaponry, the size of weaponry. It limits the use of certain artillery. This deal has not been observed by the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians it's been proven that they've used artillery up to 285 mil. I'm not sure if is that caliber. We're not gun experts here in Australia, but 285 mil barrels. That's actually quite large. That's a very large piece of artillery. So it limited the use of that, which has since the Ukrainians have not observed. It set down the rules for the de-escalation of the Donbass conflict, which was not observed. It also one of the compromises that the republics had to make was that a stipulation of the Minsk agreement was that they would not press charges for any of the war crimes committed in Donbass. And so that was a compromise on their part, where they said, look, for the sake of the future peace, we're going to have a mutual amnesty. Is that that's quite a swallow of pride, I think, but they did it. They said, we're going to have a mutual amnesty. And the treaty was not observed. Anyway, what we had shortly after that, just 1 second, we had shortly after that was what we call Minsk number 2, because that treaty wasn't followed. The Russians continued the diplomacy and they managed to broker the Minsk 2 agreements, which basically were an attempt at enforcing and echoing the previous agreement. Again, it was just not observed. So the Minsk agreements obviously were signed in Minsk, which is in Belarus. So Belarus acted as a mediator between these regions. But so that's, I guess, why you could say it took a while, is because by all accounts, the Russians were trying to follow a diplomatic course. The Russians didn't want to cause a conflict straight away. Whether that was for the fact that they thought maybe they didn't think they were ready for it, maybe they were afraid that it would attract too much attention from the West, who might then decide to get themselves involved. Who knows what the reasoning was, but the fact is they didn't go in, and they were brokering diplomatic treaties.
And I've wondered that too, as you say. I mean, why are they not worried that the West is going to get involved and that the West is going to go to war with Russia? Because I just don't understand why Putin would want war with the West. I mean, I don't get the impression that is what he wants. I mean, I think for all of the bad that comes with Putin, I think he does love his country in a way. I mean, yeah, he's a kind of a brute, I think, but I don't get the sense that he's a guy who just wants to go and start wars. Honestly, if you look at the past history, who is the one always going in and starting wars? It's not Russia. It's America. It's always, I mean, I hate to say it, guys. I mean, I'm the one American here, but I mean, if you look through the last if you look through the last 70 years, what country is always involved with war around the world? And it's almost without, and maybe sometimes it's the CIA, but if you look at, Venezuela and all these different cases, sometimes it was conducted in the dark, but the US is always going around putting their fingers where they don't belong. And oftentimes, or maybe most of the time, it's for oil, right? That's at least my impression of it. The US gains from Syria, they gain from Libya, they gain from Venezuela. And so I guess, is that something? Is the U.S. directly involved with this, and NATO, not just the U.S. I mean NATO too, but the U.S. is typically the forerunners of that. Are they benefiting from this?
Well, I was going to basically try and give Matthew a chance to speak, because I've been speaking a fair bit, but I'm not sure if he would know about this, which is particularly relevant. Is that
No, I'm
quite
interested to learn. Go for it. Go for it.
well, quite interestingly, before before Ukraine started to have the internal, I guess, internal problems start to take place and meddling, they, believe it or not, discovered that off their coast and in their territory they had huge reserves of oil and natural gas. So it is actually an extremely rich, it's an extremely rich region. It always has been. That's one of the things that people are just, their minds are almost boggled at the moment, is that Ukraine is basically a third world country at the moment, and they took a dive from being the most wealthy and important, because they actually were arguably more important to the Soviet Union than Russia. Even Russia was the seat of their power, but Ukraine was extremely important. They went from being extremely wealthy to being that poor. And interestingly, I guess a lot of people have said that you can point that to the corruption, which obviously hasn't gone away. And in the time since the dissolution of the Soviet Union, that was the point where the president of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, the Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic, and then Boris Yeltsin, who was the president of the Russian Soviet Socialist Republic. They all got together behind, what was his name again? Behind Gorbachev's back, and they said, you know what we're going to do? We're going to leave the Soviet Union without Gorbachev knowing, because they were fully entitled to do that. According to the constitution of the USSR, any Soviet Socialist Republic was entitled to leave at the drop of a hat. And so they got together and they said, if we leave, there is no Soviet Union. And people couldn't tell the idea or the motives from every single one, but they said, from Boris Yeltsin's perspective in particular, he was the president of Russia, which made him number two in line of authority. And all he had to do was say, I've decided to leave, and then now he's number one. So he became the head of Russia at the time. Make of that what everyone will. But as for, I guess, in particular, they then Ukraine. I'm not sure exactly what path Ukraine took through the 90s. Russia obviously went through a very bad economic situation. But either way, by the time the oil and gas reserves were discovered in Ukraine, they did not have the wealth to be able to fund extracting them. And so what happened was they thought, well, we'll need to get foreign investors in here. And Russia said, hey, that's great. We're going to invest money into you. And the United States, or in particular the West, had said, we don't really want to invest too much because you've got so much corruption going on. So, and then the Russian investments were stalled. Either way, they were left with huge amounts of resources, and they just did not have the ability to actually to use it. They didn't have the ability to use it, so they're actually still there now. That's another point that people have made about Crimea, is aside from Crimea's historical and traditional and almost sentimental value to Russia, as they say it, as well as militarily, because Crimea is a peninsula. Crimea has a huge amount of coastal territory, which includes a huge amount of the oil reserves. So by taking Crimea, those oil reserves are now no longer in Ukrainian territory, which means no longer in potential NATO territory. And the reason why the potential NATO territory isn't any kind of speculation theory, that goes all the way back to, I think it was 2007 or 2008, when the NATO, whichever it was an official declaration of NATO or the United States. They said Ukraine and Georgia will be part of NATO. We will make certain that they become part of NATO. I'm not sure if people know exactly where Georgia is. I think for any American viewers, they're probably thinking, which state is that one again? That's where Stalin's from, right? And yeah, Stalin's a great American.
Yeah, right. Just above Alabama, right? So I
Mm,
imagine
yeah,
most
just-
Americans picture Stalin with this really deep South accent.
Yeah, exactly. No, but so Georgia is directly north of Armenia and Turkey, and it is ironically falls very close to what's called the Caucasian oil fields, which for more than 100 years have been extremely important for Russia's, even just their strategic strength. It was actually so important that in both world wars, a tactic the Germans used was to try and reach the Dead Sea, cut through Ukraine to the Dead Sea to cut off Russia from the Caucasian oil fields. That was Stalingrad. The Battle of Stalingrad was the battle where the Russians said, no matter what happens, we cannot let the Germans cut us off from the Caucasus. And that was why Stalingrad was such such a
crazy
brutal
history.
battle.
Oh, crazy. And a great book. I don't remember who the writer is of it, but it's one of the all-time classic war novels called Stalingrad. Oh, I don't remember his name, but an incredible story. I mean, just an incredible battle that lasted years, right? And just read it. I mean, maybe I'll even attach a link to it because I read that a couple of years ago, and it really just blew my mind. But anyway, yeah.
Yeah, no, it really was it was a whole new level. That was the battle to end the war almost. Also, Stalin had a slight sentimental attachment to Stalingrad. But so Georgia, which is a country obviously now just south of or in the Caucasus, took. Oh, and this is just actually, I probably should point out here, this in particular, this isn't like any kind of just me reading the history, and this isn't just sort of personal speculation. There's a man in the United States. His name is John J. Mearsheimer or Mearsheimer, and he is an expert and a teacher as well. But he's an expert on American foreign policy and strategy. And he talked about this in 2015 and 2016. He was saying this is going to cause a crisis in Ukraine, this has already caused the crisis in Ukraine. And he says, first of all, you look at 2007, when NATO said Georgia and Ukraine will become part of NATO. Ukraine wasn't much of a problem back then because they weren't actually interested in being part of NATO. They were not a West-leaning country. They were still reasonably pro-Russian, or at the very least, they were very interested in being neutral. But Georgia is slightly different, and as the saying goes, they took that opportunity or that declaration as a guarantee that they could get uppity with the Russians. And long story short, very reminiscent of Ukraine now, or rather Ukraine is very reminiscent of then. It resulted in a conflict between Russia and Georgia, where the Georgians were completely destroyed. The country's still there. The Russians didn't actually incorporate the whole country. They did incorporate some territories which were more pro-Russian. So I actually don't know the history of that enough to know exactly what the Georgians were doing to cause, in their case as well, there were separatist states in Georgia who said, we want to be part of Russia, which are now part of Russia. So that same thing happened in Georgia. This was in 2008, I think. It was very long time ago. No one really remembers it because everything was going down in the Middle East at that point. I think possibly, I don't know when was Iraq going on, or Afghanistan at least was at that point. But it wasn't big news. It was very just it was a footnote almost, but it did happen. And after NATO and the US made that announcement, Russia said, "No, that's too far. You can't say that. You can't just start picking countries which aren't even in Europe anymore. They're not on the North Atlantic. They partly wonder why Turkey is even in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It's like, yeah, I mean that's fine, but like they saw it as an infringement." But yeah, that's sort of, I guess, one of the big that's a big I guess piece of history which people should probably keep in mind.
Well, and I read somewhere that in 1991, NATO pledged to the Kremlin not to expand further. So that was in 1991. And then over the years, they expanded into, here they say, into Poland, Czech Republic, Hungary, Estonia, Bulgaria, Romania, Croatia, Georgia, Macedonia. I mean, again, why are we surprised what's going on here? I mean, clearly Russia and the West have been at odds for 70 years, and there's different culture, there's different reasons for that. And as Matt said really well earlier, it's not necessarily good and bad. I mean, it's just different perspectives. They're different countries with different goals, and a lot of it's oil, a lot of it's territory, a lot of it's military. And I think one of the my points I wanted to make with this show was the idea of be a little more informed and don't just think Putin is just this crazy guy who just wants to kill people. That's just silly. I mean, doesn't mean he's right. I don't know he's right, but I mean, come on. I mean, the U.S. and NATO have been starting wars and have been pushing for this for years. And when Putin, who's this big bad bear, and he was KGB, and yeah, he's probably not the nicest of guys, and you just go and you're just poking him in the gut all the time. It's like, well, what on earth do you think is going to happen? And then to tear up treaties or not to follow treaties and to always push, trying to expand your territory east, 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 east. Eventually, your enemy, or at least someone who's not your ally, is going to say stop. As you say, they say enough. You can't just keep pushing this, and it just makes sense militarily. Now, again, is it moral for Russia to invade? I don't know. I'm not a moral expert. I mean, I guess it's a difficult question, but it's totally not as simple as the media is trying to portray.
Yeah, I agree. And I guess as well, what's kind of a bit not nice about it is it's kind of like, is it NATO and the US poke the bear, but it's not US's or NATO's. I mean, no, I don't know, it's a treaty, but it's not like, say, the US's soil that cops it, right? They've done something, and now it's not even them copying it. And you got these people in Ukraine who are now copying it, who are getting, I guess, punished for something. I guess they haven't even brought about, if that makes sense. But one thing I was going to ask, if I recall correctly, and maybe Alex will be better with this, but so I think I was reading or watching a video, or whatever, about this NATO saying we're not going to expand. Am I correct, or do I recall correctly that was there a bit of a pact there that NATO said, hey, we won't expand if you, Russia, disband the Warsaw Pact, which is kind of like a NATO equivalent for the East. So is that right? So if that is correct, I guess I guess what that kind of means, right, is NATO goes, hey, we're gonna stop here if Russia, you kind of do the same thing and you disband, and Russia goes, hey, you know what? Let's disband the Warsaw Pact, which is kind of our equivalent of NATO. The NATO goes, we're going to expand anyway. Is that correct rendition of it, Alex, or have I got the facts wrong there?
Well, just to point out, I guess it might be important to make a quick summary of the history of NATO and the Warsaw Pact. I'll make it quick, but so just after World War II, I actually don't know the exact dates, but shortly after World War II, the Western countries, the United States, France, Germany. Well, Germany, though, was almost not even much of a player at that point, but France and Britain were all obviously worried about the expansion of the Soviet Union, the expansion of the communists. They sort of thought, wow, the idea of giving as much territory to the Soviet Union as they asked for really kind of backfired. Um, and then resulting in the division of Germany. And they created the NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. They signed the North Atlantic Treaty, creating the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And by all public accounts, the official reason for NATO was to ensure peace and security in Europe. And America and Canada, I think Canada wanted to take an active part in that. Very shortly after, that was the official reason. The unofficial reason was, we see the Soviet Union as a threat. We're doing this to contain them. That was not public. That was not something that they wanted people to know about, because the way international politics works is that even something which normal people might consider, that's not that big a deal. The signing of a treaty, especially of a military alliance, is actually in itself somewhat threatening to people who could find themselves on the opposing end of that. Anyway, so NATO was created, and Stalin said, hey, that's a great idea. This is the best idea ever, ensuring peace and security of Europe. Can we join? Where do we sign? So the Soviet Union asked to join the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Churchill was all for it. He was like, that's a great idea. We'll let them in. Then we can all sort of work and make sure it happens. The United States was not interested. And they had to make up basically some excuse, because they couldn't say this is against you, because that is automatically it's a microaggression. No, that's automatically not even a micro. That's an aggressive act in international politics. They said, we can't let you in because too much of Russia is not in Asia. So, because the whole eastern part of Russia, too much of Russia is not in Europe. The whole eastern part is in Asia. Just forget about the fact that Turkey isn't in Europe either. But aside from that, they said you can't join because you're not a European country. We're not classing you as a European country. And Stalin, who was not an idiot, some people say he was insane. Maybe he was, but he wasn't an idiot either. He said, well, if that's how it is, we're going to assume that this is this is basically a treaty superpower in the making. And it's an existential threat to anyone who feels like they could be on the receiving end. So it was after the North Atlantic Treaty Organization was formed that the USSR got together with the Warsaw Pact countries, and they said, we're signing the Warsaw Pact, we're creating the Warsaw Pact Organization, which is going to be the counterbalance to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And that is how the Cold War started. So even going back to then, the Cold War started with the first step being taken by the US. And as a show of good faith, the USSR said, if you let us join NATO, we will reunify Germany right now. This was in the 40s. We'll reunify Germany right now, east-west. It doesn't have to happen. It'll become a single country, and we'll ensure it's a permanent buffer state, which means they're neutral. They're not west or northern aligned, but they were all part of NATO, because there wasn't the NATO Warsaw Pact division at that point. It was, we'll all be part of NATO, and this will be a neutral country in NATO, all working together for the security of Europe. Now, there's probably grounds to think that Stalin possibly did not have the best intentions. Some people say he wasn't even that interested in joining NATO. He just wanted to ask, because he knew that if he was rejected, he knew how to take that. So that's the history there. So it was always seen that NATO and the Warsaw Pact counterbalancing moving on, not really much happened in that sense for a while. Turkey actually joined NATO quite early, I think. They were definitely there in the 60s during the Cuban Missile Crisis. I know that because when the USSR was sending their missiles to Cuba, Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy said, that is not going to happen. If your ships come close, we'll sink them. And Khrushchev said, all right. You know, we'll pay that. We'll help you out. They said, but we want something in return. Diplomacy is about compromise. And Kennedy said, all right, fine. And their agreement was that Cuba will not be armed. The Russians won't even try to put anything there. And all of the nuclear facilities and missiles in Turkey will be taken away, because the Russians said, you don't want us close, well, we don't want you close. If we're going to agree not to get close, you have to agree not to get close. They didn't say Turkey should leave NATO. They just said nuclear missiles gone. Obviously, Ukraine is far closer to Moscow than Turkey was. But interestingly, Kennedy did not allow that to become public. This is, I guess, a bit of an insight into how the American politics kind of works. The way the Americans saw it was Kennedy said no, the Russians said okay. But it was not public for a very long time that it was a compromise, but it was not allowed to be shown because it was seen, could have been shown as seen as a loss of face. Moving on to the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact. Again, I think it was echoed. It first happened with Gorbachev, and it was echoed with Yeltsin. But I think there could possibly were two separate occasions. But at the very least, I'm almost certain that in the 80s, when Gorbachev was working with the United States, with NATO, at which point he became a very popular figure in America. He was actually, America didn't have a problem with the USSR at that point. They were like, oh, this is great. They're all working together. It's fantastic. Anyway, so there was a unofficial agreement that the Warsaw Pact will be disbanded. The Iron Curtain and the Berlin Wall will come down. Germany will be reunified. Germany will become entirely part of NATO for the moment. Well, they said West Germany is already part of NATO, so if they unify, they will become part of NATO. The Warsaw Pact countries will basically become free of Soviet military, and the Soviets had to build camps and installations in their territory, because when they pulled all the soldiers out of the Warsaw Pact countries, they needed somewhere to put them. They couldn't put them anywhere else, so they bunkered them down there. And the agreement, this was a verbal agreement, so it's actually, yes, it's not binding. It's not something you can count on. But the important thing to keep in mind about these verbal agreements is that while it's not something that is, I mean, there is the morality of lying, but while there is no binding aspect to it, the interesting thing about verbal agreements in international politics is that is how they build trust, and that's also how they lose trust. And so this verbal agreement was made, the words being not 1 inch further east, not 1 inch. This was denied by every US official ever for the next 20 years. They said that never happened. This never took place. No one ever mentioned anything, even though after Boris Yeltsin, who was also then became quite popular in the United States, because he went to the United States and he addressed a joint session of Congress and said, people of Russia, extend our hands to work with the United States to build a better and more stable world. We want to work together. Russia and America are the two big powers. The problem there was that, in essence, he was told, take a hike. Russia's not the Soviet Union anymore. Russia's not important. And the Russians themselves did not much like this. But it was repeated to him, apparently, not 1 inch. We're not going to expand NATO. This was fine for a long time. This was fine until for the first 4 years of Bill Clinton. And it was only in his second term that he said, you know what, these countries are going into NATO. As soon as it happened, the story goes that Yeltsin was absolutely outraged, and he was disappointed. And he said, you can't treat us like this. We had a verbal agreement. You can't just start infringing on our sphere of influence after we had an understanding. And I think, from what I heard, his words were basically he couldn't do anything at that point. Russia was in too much trouble. But he said, Russia will rise again. He said, you mark my words, Russia will rise again, and you will learn that you can't treat us like this.
And I want to cut in real quick. What does NATO gain from bringing these Eastern countries in? As you say, the agreement, it should be for the Western countries. It's Europe and I guess the US and Canada for whatever reason, because the US wants to control everything in the world. But I mean, what do they gain? I mean, I guess, are they just doing this to be able to plunder, the resources, or what's the point? What's the point of bringing these countries into NATO?
It really is quite hard to say, because the point of NATO became obviously to contain the Soviet Union, but in a way the Russians basically, they must be asking themselves the same thing. Who are you trying to contain? Why are you going eastward? Who is it? Who is the enemy? They're like, we know that you regard China as a political rival. Enemy is quite a strong word unless you're talking about Russia. You regard China, but what's the point of NATO? Then fast forward to the year 2000 when Putin is elected. Again, everyone will have their controversy about how legitimate or such and such that was. But the fact is, he took power, and he contacted NATO and said, hey, can Russia join NATO? He said NATO was formed publicly to protect peace and security in Europe. It became obvious later it was a counterbalance to the Soviet Union, to the communists, to this, I guess as they call it, to the Bolshevism that Russia had been trying to distance itself from ever since the Bolsheviks were, in essence, kicked out. And said, can we join NATO? And America said, no, you can't. Reminiscent of Stalin, and again how Stalin took it. And they said, okay, well, that's fine. He said, can we have some sort of agreement? Can we join the European Union? And they said, no, you can't join. And the question the Russians must have been asking themselves is, why not? The same reason, possibly the same question Stalin was asking himself, but Stalin knew the answer. And I guess it's possible that after in the 10 years from the dissolution of the Soviet Union to the time when they started expanding eastwards, it's possible that the United States thought to themselves, oh, we thought Russia was down and out, but maybe they're not. And so they took in more countries into NATO, and the Russians were outraged, obviously, and they took it as a direct insult. One thing, just quickly, I mentioned how the United States officials had always denied this verbal agreement. They said it never happened. Not too long ago, when I say that, I mean like within the last 10 years, a certain government department declassified the recordings of the conversations between the United States. I actually think it was the presidents. I think it was Gorbachev and Reagan at the time. And it is definitely what he said. He said not 1 inch. It's people for 20 years were saying, "Oh, it never happened." All the American people in conversations were like, "No, we have confidence. It never happened." Our government said didn't happen, never happened, and the Russians were like, "Hang on, our said it did happen, so it happened." So there's this loyalty to your own government. Um, but then it came out, and they were like, "Oh, yeah, it did happen." Just by the way, we didn't want to admit it for a while until we had to. So I guess that's a big case of, as I mentioned, a loss of trust. And one thing that Vladimir Posner, the guy I mentioned earlier, had said, he said the relationship right now, and this was a couple of years ago, he said the relationship between the United States and Russia right now is worse than it ever was between the United States and the Soviet Union. He said that there is far more mistrust, there is far more dislike, and there is far more competitive attitude among even the general people. He said the people of Russia, this is a guy who had been in Russia, he said the people in Russia would make a deal, would support a deal with the United States tomorrow, any day. He said, but they don't want to be trifled with. And so if they feel that that's not going to happen, they don't want to compromise. And there is, again, just coming back to the actual current situation, is that there's all of the media coverage saying, 90% of, I'm making that figure up, 90% of Russians just say don't support the war in in Ukraine. I don't know how they come up with these figures, because I mean the Russian Federation can't even get a percentage that high for their elections. So I don't know where they get all these figures from. But there's all this coverage saying, they're all this, but you just can't possibly know. And all of the stories of the Russian soldiers saying, we were lied to, we didn't know what we were doing. Maybe it's real, maybe it's fake. You can't really tell.
But that's a really good point, because that's really important to remember that if it's war, which it is right now, both sides are clearly dealing in propaganda. I mean, that's absolutely certain. That always happens in war, and it's kind of expected. I guess it's not okay, because if it's a lie, then no lie is good. But it's what you expect, and so that's why I'm so surprised. Maybe I shouldn't be, but people just eat it all up. They just eat. They hear these things about we were joking about Saint Zelensky, because that's how people treat him. He's just like this heroic figure, and this just the greatest man that ever lived, and sacrificing for his people. And it's like, if you spend 5 minutes looking into Zelensky, the dude's a total creep. He's a total dirtbag. I mean, I'm sorry, that he is. Now, is he suffering? Or is people suffering? Sure. I have a really hard time publicly supporting a guy, a politician, who is so clearly immoral and backs. I mean, he's pro gay, he's pro abortion, he's pro everything bad as far as I've seen. And I've seen these quotes of him saying something like, what was the quote? Something like, every we will defend every church and every basilica to the last man, or something like that. They will not take our churches from us. And the guy is a Jew. Now, I'm not saying he's a Christian hate. He is. I mean, I'm not saying he's a Christian hater or anything. Maybe he's not. Maybe he's perfectly fine and equal rights between religions, whatever. But it's like, this isn't a guy who's like the staunch Christian or Catholic. I mean, take whatever you want from him being a Jew. I'm not even trying to be, anti-Semitic. I'm just saying he's not Christian, so he doesn't have this firm belief in Catholicism or Christianity or defending the churches. He's just aiming for sound bites. And he probably didn't even say it. It was probably attributed to him by some media organization. And this stuff happens so often, especially now, because people are so dumb they just believe anything that's tweeted. And I think that's something, again, I just wanted to clear up with the show, which I think Alexander's done really well at just saying, okay, this is what's happened. These are the things that have actually happened. This is why it's going on. We don't know a lot of it. I mean, we don't have a clue of what's going through Putin's head. I mean, but when you really look into it and see what's been going on for the last 20 years and how NATO is clearly poking the bear, just realize, again, it's not as clear as the media is saying. And clearly the media is just pushing propaganda every second they can.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, I guess, for your opinions. So hearing Alexander talk, and I haven't looked into a lot of that, so this is like a lot of this is new to me. But when I'm sort of hearing it at a high level, it kind of sounds like basically maybe the US or Westerns, let's say the US and NATO, don't trust Russia, and they might have really valid reasons, and Russia just doesn't trust them. And maybe they're both kind of like, well, it's us or them. So, and if they're going to start expanding, well, I guess that's kind of time for us to defend. But then the US might be like, but if we don't expand, then maybe Russia's going to start building the upper hand. I don't know. I think I remember from World War II, Russia built slowly, but once it got going, it was practically unstoppable. But I don't know. But would you say it's a bit of an oversimplification of things, or is that a kind of a possibility that you've just got two powers that kind of want to defend each other, but they have sometimes you feel like you have to get on the offense to defend? I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
I mean, I'll let Alex answer that, but my one of my gut feelings on that is that if that's true, why is there not more fear about China? It just seems so manufactured to me. So it's like, I mean, I think that Russia, sure, maybe there is some threat there. I mean, Putin is kind of a wild card, and as you say, I mean, Western Europe is. I live in Germany, and there's always jokes about how bad the German military is. They can't. They have like no working helicopter. What do they say? One of my friends said they have something like 3 working military helicopters in the entire country. I don't know if that's the right number, but it's embarrassing. They have practically no military because they've relied on the U.S. for the last probably 70 years, so they have no military. And so if Putin really wanted to invade Western Europe, yeah, he probably could. So I can understand why that's kind of a threat, but if that's the case, why does nobody seem to care besides Trump what's going on in China? China is clearly trying to spread their influence across the world, and they're doing a darn good job about it. While when I look at Russia, Russia is pretty much like, hey, you see this little tiny area over here, we want it, and stop messing with it, kind of a thing. While China's like buying all the country, everything in Australia and New Zealand and the US, they're just buying everything. They're just going around like, yep, we own that now, and nobody seems to care. And that's what is, for me, makes it kind of fishy. But maybe Alex has a better answer for that.
Well, it's just really impossible to say what the mindset is for why to support one opposed the other. And one thing which is quite important to keep in mind is that China is very heavily supported by the US and by the EU. A very large part of the Chinese economy relies, they annually trillions upon trillions upon trillions of dollars worth of their economy comes from trade with the EU and with the United States. They're almost entirely reliant on them. And people talk about, the Russians and Chinese, they work so close. Well, they are very close geographically, but the reliance on each other is very small. The economic need for any of them on each other, it's very small. They don't need each other anywhere near as much as China and the West need each other. And I think that could be one reason, is that Russia has been cut off and then sanctioned for so long that they're not as much a part of the global economy as as a country of their size really could be, and it harms them. Um, how much it harms them, people can't really say. An interesting point I'd heard made is that the US can come out and they can impose sanctions, and the rest of NATO just basically has to follow along with them. And I've seen interviews and talks by Putin talking about just this fact, and he said, "You know what? Sanctions have been the best thing for our country. It's forced us to get our manufacturing. It's forced us to improve our industry. It's forced us to improve our food production. Um, we're our economy has dropped." He said that's a fact. We're not as rich. He said, but we have more capability. He said, but the sanctions cost us money. But in Europe, the sanctions cost them jobs. The people who were working to put the stuff into Russia that they were importing,
and
they now have to
energy.
make. And energy. That's the biggest thing about this is that I guess you start to say what is the actual, and this is actually another thing that Putin even mentioned more recently. He said we can look at the fact that the US can't take these sanctions all that seriously if, in order to sanction us, they're now breaking the sanctions that they have with other countries. They're starting to work with Venezuela, who they've sanctioned. They've started to work with Iran, who they've sanctioned. And he said, so basically they will sanction as long as they can, but if they need to stop, he said they'll come back. And I guess the economic bet is that the United States and the West will need the energy before Russia needs to get rid of it. Because the fact is that Russia does have they've got all the energy, they've got all the oil.
You want to know why? Because the German leadership, especially, but I mean Europe too, they're a bunch of idiots. They're a bunch of morons who decided, hey, let's go hug some trees and shut down all of our nuclear reactors. But I guess no, we're gonna pipe in all of our fuel and all of our energy from Russia, who we don't trust. It's so remarkably stupid that it's like, in the end, I kind of look at it like, maybe all this war and stuff. I always wonder, okay, are these leaders really stupid or really evil? Because you see the chaos that they create. Maybe it's both, but the energy crisis in Germany tells me they are just either they truly just want to run the world into the ground, which that's possible. It's a conspiracy theory, I suppose. But I think it's possible they are just legitimately dumb people. That just they don't think things through. They just say, "Oh, this is a cool idea. Yeah, green. Let's save the planet." And they don't even think past step one. They just think this is good and it'll make me look good with the people. And then they don't think of, okay, how are we actually going to get energy? And then they have to then buy the energy from Russia. And now Putin holds Germany and Europe over his knee, and he can just swat them anytime and you see it now. I think that's part of why he invaded. He's got all the leverage because he's got the energy. And it's remarkable again that again, even if it's immoral what Putin is doing, even if Putin invaded Western Europe, which again, I'm not saying this is a good thing, of course, but I mean, I wouldn't even blame him. I mean, it's like the Western Europe has just been like, hey, Putin, we're really dumb. We're gonna have no military. We're not gonna try to fix our infrastructure. We're not gonna fix any of our energy. We're gonna rely on you to provide us with energy. It's like, well, I mean, we kind of deserve war. And I know it's harsh, and maybe it's wrong. I don't mean morally, but like in terms of just practical sense, we deserve it.
From a safeguard, though, if that's part of NATO, isn't it? So let's just say Russia did decide to do it, then US and all the allies would start coming in, wouldn't they? Is that right, or have I?
Yeah.
Well,
Right.
so yeah, it's called the Article 5 guarantee. And Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization says that if any country, if any signatory of the treaty is subject to aggression, every single signatory of the treaty must regard this act of aggression as an attack upon their own state. So, which means if you declare war on any country, or if any actual, and not even that, if any country in NATO says, "Hey, the Russians attacked us," every country in NATO is required to declare war immediately. And that is, again, one of the reasons why Putin did not want Armenia, sorry, not Armenia, did not want Georgia and did not want Ukraine in NATO, is because these are countries that directly border Russia. They have border clashes all the time. And if Ukraine was to say, "Oh, the Russians attacked us," and with Article 5, they all have to go in. And then it's just a case of how long does it last before someone gets desperate enough to pull the nuclear trigger. That's also a reason why a number of NATO countries do not actually want Ukraine in there, because Ukraine is too much of a liability. It's too much of a security risk. They don't want to have a war due to some border clash between Ukraine, because the risk is, or the fear is, that if Ukraine, or if anyone in Ukraine, like literally anybody, could say, "Oh, I think it would be a good idea to have a war with Russia at this point. We can't do it alone, but we're in NATO, so they'll do it for us." They can immediately, they can do anything. It's so easy to stage a false flag, and that's not something unseen throughout history, where people, in order to start a war or to end a friendship,
look at the Nazis in Poland, right? The attack on the what was it, a radio tower or something, that they went and pretended that the Poles came in and killed a bunch of the German soldiers, and the Germans just did it themselves. They just faked it all and put them in different outfits, and
yeah.
it worked, I suppose. It got public opinion more on their side, at least.
I don't remember that event in particular, but even at that point, there was so much stuff going on during Poland. But it was a thing come out later as well, that the NKVD had gotten hold of German uniforms, and when they went into Poland, they were committing atrocities against the Poles. So there's this back and forth of everyone trying to make everyone else look bad.
Oh man,
that's
ridiculous.
So all it takes is anything to cause a conflict between Ukraine and Russia. And the problem is that Ukraine is, just geopolitically speaking, it is actually incredibly hard to defend from the West. It is very easy for Russia to get. It is very easy to enter Ukraine from the east. It is much harder to attack or defend or supply Ukraine from the west, because they have to deal with the I think it's the Carpathian mountain range just to the west, and they also have to deal with the Pripyat marshes to the north. So Ukraine is actually not very well poised for defense from the west. And so the problem with, I guess this could also explain why just recently Zelensky has basically canned the idea of Ukraine joining NATO is, first of all, if there was that situation were to take place where Ukraine would be caught in the middle of a war with Russia, Ukraine would almost certainly be steamrolled anyway, because NATO could not really, they would have to already have quite a defense set up. And then again, that's the risk. That's something that the Russians are not quite keen on. That's something that they would see as a risk. And so chances are, if a war were to break out between NATO and Russia because of Ukraine, Ukraine would just become occupied anyways, and then a defensive line would have to be drawn by the Russians, and the West would be fighting a war for people who don't even, for a country that doesn't even exist anymore.
And so if the U.S., because Zelensky keeps calling for a no-fly zone, and so if the U.S. or Poland or whoever creates this no-fly zone and goes in, which is, I mean, as far as I understand, going to war with Russia, right, over Ukraine, would that also force NATO to have to go to war with Russia? I mean, because I know the no-fly zone is a really big deal, and you hear people calling for it all the time. Save Ukraine. Create air, safe airspace. And it's like, I don't think it's that simple, and that's why they haven't done it. I think that's
Mhm.
as far as I can understand.
Well, I guess you could say this is something that that Putin has actually played quite well. Is that he's drawn the line and he said how Russia will take things. So him saying, if you create any country, if they create a no-fly zone, we take that as an act of war. You're joining the war. If any countries supply airplanes to Ukraine, we take that as an act of war. You are joining the war. If any countries allow their airstrips to be a base for Ukrainian pilots, that's fine. But we take that as an act of war and you are joining the war. The reason why that is important to specify is because that does not come with an Article 5 guarantee. So any country who does that, then every other country in NATO says, hey, that's not an act of aggression against you, that's you joining. So whichever country does that is on their own. That's why they don't want to do it, because if Poland does it, if a conflict breaks out between Poland and Russia, they're officially they're on their own, and that's again a huge problem for NATO because they could decide to join or they could not. Half of them could decide to join, or half, and the other half couldn't. The US could say, "Hey, we're going to join, and we're going to go to Poland and we're going to fight the Russians." And then Russia could say, "Any country which provides military access to a warring nation, which they are fully entitled to do. If Poland is at war with Russia, and the United States is at war with Russia, it is a big no-no of, I guess you could say, international decency for a country to say, yeah, we're a neutral country. Your military can go through ours. We're not going to let them through. You can go through ours and attack them. That's quite a big no-no. That is actually an act of war. And so if America says, hey, we're going to go into Poland and fight the Russians, the French won't let them through. The Germans probably won't let them through. Any how do you say, any national waters will say, we can't let you through. We don't want to take part in this, which will draw us into a war. So it is actually quite a smart tactic by Putin, because it uses a network of diplomatic treaties to his advantage.
And so I think we've gone hour 40 now already. We may have to cut this up into two shows somehow, but I think it's been really fascinating. I think that I would ask, maybe I'll start with Matt. I mean, ask the purely opinion. I mean, we have no idea, obviously, but Matt, what's your opinion? How do you think this ends?
Well, it's a really good question, and you're asking someone who doesn't have 10 degrees in political science and all that. I actually, look, I'm going to just put my hands up and say I don't know. The only thing I sometimes sort of speculate is it kind of reminds me a little bit of, and I don't want to cause grave concern here. I've seen political commentators who seem like they know what they're talking about, saying it's probably just going to end, like there's probably just going to be some agreement and everything's just going to go back to normal, and that would be a pretty good outcome. But I kind of, it reminds me a little bit of World War II in some ways, or at least the beginning with Germany. You know, Germany being, if my understanding is correct, a bit more nationalist minded. Because my understanding is that even though Russia was very, very communist, my understanding is they've actually kind of changed a lot. And maybe because they've been through the depths of the terribleness, for lack of a better term, I don't even know if that's a word, but like just the horrificness of communism, maybe they've bounced back a little bit. And I would almost make an argument speculative that Western society is becoming potentially more communist than Russia is now, just through different means, right? Russia just went boom and then like straight down, and maybe they're coming up going, this didn't work at all. Where maybe Western civilizations are sort of getting this slowly, and they've maybe yet to discover just how terrible it is. I mean, with communism, Bolshevism, and so on, it's condemned by the church. We know that as well. So it's not even an argument there. But yeah, I wonder sometimes, you got this more nationally minded nation, and I don't know. It kind of reminds me, and the sanctions as well. I think there were sanctions against Germany before World War II broke out, or leaned to that. I'm not really a historian, but there were just some sort of similarities there, which I thought were kind of interesting. But look, if I had to put my money on it, I'd hope that it kind of just comes to a peace agreement and something happens. Maybe Russia gets Crimea or whatever, and then things go back. But honestly, yeah, I have no idea. It'll be very interesting, but hopefully it doesn't escalate too much and doesn't bring all these other countries with it, because quite frankly, I just don't think that'd be any good.
Agreed. Yeah, Alex, what do you think?
Well, I don't want to ramble on too long, but I guess just to build on slightly what Matt has said, is that people who say that right now that Russia is still communist, publicly they say, "Oh, Russia's definitely still communist." If they're saying that, they really they don't understand what communism actually is. Some people think communism is just totalitarianism. That's totalitarianism. It's a totally different thing. Some people might say, "Oh, it's just bad." So if someone's bad, they're no. But communism is it's an ideology. It's not a system of government. It's technically it's not even quite. It's supposedly seen as a economic system, but it's not that either. It's an ideology, and it's a social ideology, and it does not require anything even remotely associated with the Soviet Union in order to be communist. Communism can be anywhere where people believe it. Really, that's just the way it is. They don't even have to call themselves communist. And just from the Catholic perspective, it's probably quite productive to read the encyclicals against communism, because the idea of encyclicals against communism isn't saying, "Hey, communism is bad. That's it. Don't do it." The point of the encyclicals is to say, yes, communism is bad. This is why. These are the things condemned. So the thing is that a communist state, you can't say that absolutely everything they ever do is bad simply because they're a communist state. You can't condemn every action because maybe some things were just normal. But I think Pope Pius the 11th wrote a lot of them wrote against communism, but when they condemn communism, they're saying, we're not condemning people for saying I'm a communist because maybe they don't know what it is. We're saying this is condemned, this is condemned, these are the ideas of communism that we condemn. A good sort of allegory or allegorical example for how that works is that nationalism is actually condemned by the church. Now, the idea was that certain beliefs which were part of the nationalist movement are condemned. But once you hit the 1900s, a lot of Catholic groups, political organizations said, we're nationalists, because they were nationalists as opposed to international Bolshevism. It wasn't nationalism as opposed to the church, which was the previous nationalism. So that's a good example of how just by calling yourself a nationalist, that doesn't mean you believe in the ideas which are condemned nationalism. So if you really want to, and again, just because you don't call yourself a nationalist doesn't mean that you don't fall under those condemned beliefs. As for where it's all going, you won't really know. You won't know until afterwards. I don't think the media on either side is giving any kind of, well, it's hard to say because it's really hard to access Russian media. It's almost impossible. So all I can say is that from what I've seen, you don't really expect to get a super realistic view of what's going on. As for what could happen, some people say, "Oh, this is the end of Ukraine." I personally don't really think that would happen. I mentioned earlier that for Ukraine to become completely annexed into Russia, The only way I think that would happen is if there is far less anti-Russian sentiment in Ukraine than we actually know about, because incorporating Ukraine would be a massive headache if they are as anti-Russian. The idea of just to do with Crimea in particular, Crimea is Russia's not going to give Crimea back. That's gone. It's not coming back. It's not a concept of Ukraine giving Crimea to Russia. Russia has complete control of Crimea, and they have since 2014. I guess an interesting point just on that, which could be another, another reason for why this had to happen and why it happened and why they pushed from Crimea at the same time. This is a slight geopolitical note, is that Crimea has no natural water sources. They don't have any rivers. They don't have any fresh water at all, except the Dnieper River, which is the one running through Ukraine. A canal was created which brings water from Ukraine into the peninsula of Crimea. That's their entire source of fresh water. When Crimea joined Russia, the Ukrainians said, "You're not getting water anymore." So they blocked off the canal, and Crimea no longer has access to water. This has been going on since 2014. Apparently, one of the first things the Russians did when they went out of Crimea was they broke that dam, and the water was able to go back to Crimea. I don't think the Russians are going to give up what they have on the east of the river, because they want to ensure that doesn't happen again. They need to maintain control of water, because water is one of the biggest factors in all geopolitics across everywhere. It's a major factor. It affects so much. As for the republics, the separatist republics, there's a lot of talk of all these different possibilities for what could happen. Some people say they're going to get incorporated completely into Russia. Some people say they're going to be set up as buffer states to lower to narrow the border between Ukraine and Russia. That won't make it all that big. That won't make the border all that more narrow. But one interesting idea that I've heard floated around is that Russia might create, with their southeastern holdings, they might form a new buffer state called Novorossiya. And that comes from the period, this is just north of just north of Crimea, and it takes the new republics and goes up to Kharkov, I think. The concept behind that is that was a region that's the whole Russian region of Ukraine, basically. That's the region where the Russians in Ukraine are, and that's the region where the Ukrainians, by many accounts, were putting pressure on the Russians. The general concept being, this is Ukraine, we don't want you here. So the idea is that could be created to a buffer state, which would control part of the river. As for what happens to Ukraine proper, some people, there's theory perhaps Zelensky will be replaced, although I think he's already starting to play a slightly smarter game already. But he's already said, you can't really take his word for anything, but he's already said Ukraine will just realistically not become part of NATO. That was seriously one of the biggest things Russia wanted to hear. And that isn't necessarily him changing his mind. I think this conflict has almost ensured that, because now the West has seen Ukraine is a massive liability. NATO, being part of NATO, is going to be a risk. And I think possibly most ironic of all is that the Ukrainians possibly just do not want to be part of NATO anymore. because they see, as the Georgians did, and as the Poles did in World War II, when the Germans went in, they've said this guarantee that we have been given, that we were relying on, has not been followed through. And so this could just lead to the Ukrainians saying, well, stuff all of you. We don't care. We're going to just do our best as we can. We're going to work in our own geopolitical region and just focus on ourselves. We don't even. I think for all of the talk of Ukrainian solidarity and everyone's putting the Ukrainian flag in their profile picture. Yeah, it's nice. It's very much in tune with Western ideals, but the Ukrainians just don't care about that. And I think looking back after it's all over, some of the Ukrainians may look at how much weapons, how much ammunition, how much weaponry were poured into Ukraine, which ensured the longevity of the conflict and making it longer and longer. I think I heard someone say the US will fight to the last Ukrainian. Yeah, it's quite. That wasn't an official. That wasn't an official. That was a bit of a joke. But as I think it was Henry Kissinger who said, the USA is a dangerous enemy, but is a fatal ally, and it's possible that the Ukrainians are just not interested anymore. So it might get balkanized into a couple of states. I doubt it will be incorporated into Russia entirely, because, and if that happens, then the border of Russia gets pushed all the way to NATO, and that's what they wanted to avoid in the beginning. They always had said, we want Ukraine to be a neutral state, which we both invest in. We want a strong, powerful, neutral Ukraine, and that's best for everybody. And the USA said, well, we don't want that. And I guess if you're grouping all of those together, neutral, strong, and powerful, maybe they don't want any of it. But it's I guess it really is a case of we just have to see.
Good. Sorry, I think I'm being requested.
Yeah, sorry for taking.
No, it's good. No, I really appreciate it. I think it's been a really, really informative chat. I mean, I know a lot more now. I really appreciate that from you, Alex, that you've obviously taken a lot of time to look into what has really happened. And I think that's what's really important here. I don't think, as Matt said, I think we've all said, you don't need to pick sides. That's not the point here. We're not saying Putin's great. We're not saying Ukraine is great. We're just kind of saying, no, okay, here's the things that have actually happened that have led to this. And I think that's really important, to just be aware of what's going on and be really careful what you're sharing publicly and what you're supporting publicly. Supporting the people of Ukraine, sure. I mean, I think there's nothing wrong with that. They are suffering. I think that's totally fine. They're legitimate asylum seekers, but just make sure you know why. You know, what are you supporting? Don't just share some quote from Zelensky because everyone's telling you he's a great guy. I think that's really important. I just look a little bit into it, and I hope after, if anyone's made it through this entire 2 hour or perhaps two 1 hour podcast, yeah, I think hopefully you're now more aware of the situation that's going on, what's happened there, and that will bring a little more clarity to a very unclear issue. But I think that Alex is doing a great job. I really appreciate you both being on, and I hope that we can have another conversation that's perhaps slightly more light, I guess, I suppose, or maybe something a little more in the past. I mean, I know, Alex, it sounds like you're really well read in terms of historical. I don't know what your hot spots are, but I love history and I love learning more about it. Maybe we can talk about conflicts or past issues, because that's not quite so controversial, I suppose. But I think we've done a good job of trying to stay away from controversy, not picking sides, and just sticking through the facts of the matter. And I hope people will appreciate that. And if anyone has any questions for Alex, for Matt, for me, go ahead and send them to me at kevin89davis@gmail.com, and I can forward them to one of these guys. Probably Alex. He's our Ukrainian native, half Russian, half Ukrainian expert. And
I don't know if we have any Russian.
No Russian.
Don't know if
Okay.
there's any Russian.
Yeah, well, do one of those tests and find out, because we really need to make sure we're split on the issue here. We don't want to pick sides with our ancestry. Anyway, Matt, Alex, I really appreciate it. And until next time, God bless.
Thanks, Kevin. God bless.